So many faces. My name is Giselle Lopez. I'm the president of Creative Peace Initiatives, which is a graduate student organization here at SIS. And we started this initiative early this year, basically because we learned about what was going on in Bahrain. We learned about the connection that of the ruling family in Bahrain to SIS through the Crown Prince, who graduated from AU and donated $3 million to have our SIS atrium built, which is dedicated in his honor. So we really wanted to raise awareness about the issues in Bahrain and hopefully open a forum for discussion. So I just want to really thank all the people that have been involved in this throughout this initiative. ADHRB, the Americans for Democracy and Human Rights in Bahrain, has been working tirelessly on these issues. Mrs. Rachel can give you a little bit of an overview on the organization's efforts, as well as the faculty and activists and all other individuals who have been working really hard on this effort to raise awareness and raise this issue. So, yeah, thank you all for coming, and hope you enjoy the event.
Yes, thank you guys so very much. Just to give you a little background, Americans for Democracy and Human Rights in Bahrain is a 501c3 not-for-profit based here in DC that is working to raise awareness of and understanding of the issues and the situation in Bahrain. We work with student groups to put on events such as this. We work with the executive branch, the United Nations, Congress, and we work with all of our NGO partners who have also been working on this issue. And we are very grateful for Creative Peace Initiatives as well as the Ethics, Peace, and Global Affairs. I'm so sorry. There are a couple of student groups that have been amazing on this, and we are incredibly fortunate to have such a wonderful panel, which Professor Jeff Bachman will introduce. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you again. I want to thank Giselle and Creative Peace Initiatives for all their hard work in pulling this together, as well as the support of Americans for Democracy and Human Rights in Bahrain. Obviously, I want to thank our moderator and our panelists, and of course all of you for being here. I am Jeff Bachman. I am a professor of human rights in the School of International Service and also the co-director of the Ethics, Peace, and Global Affairs MA program here. I just want to say a few words, then I will introduce our moderator, and then I will turn it over to her. So I just want to comment on a couple of things, some of the issues related to the situation in Bahrain. Issues range from the human rights situation to state oppression to foreign policy issues. My passion about Bahrain, not just about the human rights situation there and the crackdown on the pro-democracy and pro-human rights movement, but is also the role of the United States and its relationship to Bahrain. The United States has sold weapons, including non-lethal quote-unquote weapons such as tear gas. We have a naval base located in Manama, which is only about 10 miles from Pearl Roundabout, where which is sort of the epicenter of the uprising, but also some of the most extreme crackdown on the protests themselves. So we have 15,000 service members and civilians located less than 10 miles from where this all went down. We also have other issues, I think, related to U.S. counterterrorism policy in the situation where Bahrain is allowed to justify its crackdown based on claims that these are terrorists, and therefore we're able to detain them. In some cases, I don't think they would justify it, but torture and etc. I think one of the questions as an American is, are we going to be a country that preaches certain values, but then when geostrategic or political interests seem to conflict with those, that we turn our backs on those same values, or are we going to be a country that practices what we preaches? And so with that, I will turn it over to Professor Shadi Mokhtari. I am cheating, looking at her faculty profile, which is funny because I know Shadi pretty well, but I'm going to use it as a crutch anyway. So Shadi specializes, or Professor Mokhtari specializes in human rights in the Middle East, politics, women's rights issues in the Middle East as well. If you have not seen her book, she has a proper book called After Abu Ghraib, Exploring Human Rights in America in the Middle East, which was the co-winner of the American 2010 Political Science Association Human Rights Section Best Book Award. And she's an active researcher on these types of issues, and she's a great moderator for this event. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, Shadi.
Thank you to all the organizers. Thank you to all of you for attending. This event actually reminds me quite a bit of a similar event that was held here in this very room, sponsored by the School of International Service 2 years ago. And as I was reflecting on that event and today's panel, I was thinking that quite a bit has transpired over the last 2 years in the region. And at the same time, particularly in relation to Bahrain, quite a bit remains the same and unchanged. I think most notably what has remained the same is that there hasn't been any meaningful political change or openings in Bahrain. Since the uprising, there has been persistent repression used by the Bahraini government. And there seems to also be the persistence of dissent and discontent. You have activists who are working internationally and domestically, persisting with their resistance and their activism. And you have protests that, while they're not the same size as the protests we witnessed initially, have a rhythm and momentum of their own. So, in a sense, the struggle kind of goes on in Bahrain. And as I was thinking of kind of how I envision this panel going, I'd like to ask our panelists to really focus on, draw from the experiences of the last 2.5 years and focus on what has worked and what has not worked, what opportunities there may be in the future for meaningful political reforms or political change in Bahrain. What are the key challenges that are faced, and your thoughts on how we can face those challenges? And no doubt the challenges facing the Bahraini movement for change are quite formidable. In terms of format, I'd like this to be as much of a discussion as possible. So what I would ask is of each of our guests or panelists to give kind of a brief 5 to 7 minute introductory comment from your perspective, the angle that you bring to this discussion on Bahrain. And then I'm going to pose a few questions and give you about 2 minutes each to respond if you'd like to these questions. And from there we can turn it over to the audience and have more of a conversation. Okay, so allow me to just introduce our panelists, a very esteemed group of panelists here, and I too will cheat. So just sitting next to me here is Juan Mendez. He is visiting professor of law at the Washington College of Law here at American University. Since November of 2010, he has served as the UN Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment and punishment. Before that, he was a special advisor to prevention to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Until May 2009, he was the president of the International Center for Transnational Justice. It's on your, that's what I thought it was, but I think it's misspelled on your bio, by the way. The version I got, okay. So in any case, from before that, from 2004, or concurrent with that, from 2004 and 2007 to 2007, he was named Kofi Annan's special advisor on the prevention of genocide. So quite a bit of expertise to bring to this topic, and Juan Mendez has been attempting, up till now unsuccessfully, to make his way to Bahrain in his current position. Next to him is Matar Ebrahim Matar. He is a political activist who served as the youngest member of parliament in Bahrain. He did resign along with 18 other members of the Matar Party, of which he's a member, in February of 2012 in protest to the crackdown that was taking place. He was very active during the February 14th uprising in terms of encouraging youth participation and communicating with media and foreign allies and officials, and that, of course, landed him in jail for some time. In 2011 as well, Mr. Matar was awarded the Leaders of Democracy Award from the Project on Middle East Democracy, and he is currently a fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy, where he is analyzing labor market reforms and its impact on democratization in the Gulf. Next to him is Sarah Lee Whitson, Director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa Division. She is an expert on Middle East and North Africa affairs, and she has led landmark investigations of human rights conditions in Libya and Saudi Arabia, as well as numerous advocacy missions in the region, and overseen over 20 research missions in the Middle East. She's published numerous articles on the Middle East in international and regional publications, and is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And last but not least, we have my colleague Kristin Diwan, who was actually with us on the previous panel as well. And she is a professor of comparative and regional studies here at American University. She specializes in Gulf affairs and has a particular interest in Islamic social movements as well, and particularly the political economy of Islamic social movements, and has in recent years also expanded her focus to citizenship and political reform in the Gulf region. And she is currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and has a recent publication for the Atlantic Council on the Tamarid effort in Bahrain, which is quite interesting. So with that, I will leave it for our guests to give some introductory comments. Juan, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the...
I'm so sorry. Now that I think about it, it makes more sense to have Kristin, I thoroughly apologize. Kristin Diwan start us off by way of some background and kind of the political context. So why don't we have you start us off?
Sure. Hi, welcome, and I'm so glad to see all of you here. And as Shadi mentioned, I know that we really want to talk about the current situation and how we can move forward in Bahrain, but I thought I could be sort of most useful here by giving some background and trying to understand some of the political history in Bahrain that led us to past and also the current political crisis in the country. And I wanted to highlight just a few things. One, if we look at the history of Bahrain, it's unique within the Gulf in that Bahrain was settled, the ruling family came to settle Bahrain and rule there by conquest. So you had the ruling family, the Al Khalifa, who actually came to the island, originally coming from the Najd, and with their tribal allies, overcame a population there that were mostly settled peasants working in agriculture and also in fishing. And once they settled on the island, they basically established a feudal order in Bahrain. And obviously the island has changed tremendously since this time, which was in the late 1700s and through the 1800s. Over time, as the state was created, peasants became workers in the new industries that were established in oil and also in aluminum. You had the cities developing tremendously and having much more cosmopolitan centers, as you had a lot of people immigrating to Bahrain from now current-day Iran, both the Sunni and Shia merchants coming from that area, and also other kind of workers and merchants as well coming from South Asia, so that Bahrain is also a very cosmopolitan place. But I think that this history still has a lot of resonance for Bahrainis, this initial founding. Both in the mentality that still persists amongst a lot of people in the Al Khalifa ruling family of being sort of a conquering these peoples, and also in the people who were conquered, especially the Shia original inhabitants of the island, who are known as the Baharna. A couple of other things that didn't really change even through all of these social and political changes over time. One was that a lot of inequalities still really persisted in Bahrain, particularly in these Shia communities, the Shia villages, not as much in the urban centers, but in the Shia villages. even statistics that were taken as late as the 1980s and 90s showed that literacy was much lower in these areas, a lot less political opportunity. And this even grew over time as the kind of in their isolation, a lot of them tended to take up a lot of support from clerical leaders, and then had some attraction to the revolutionary Islamist movements that came after the Iranian Revolution. And after that time, then the government was trying then to have some distrust of some of these populations and not to allow them to work in different security sectors and different areas of the state, so that there were much less opportunities for some of these communities. Another way in which things didn't really change is that there was never a great means to enforce a lot of political accountability on the ruling family, who in fact came there, as I said, as sort of conquerors and had the ability to sort of use the resources of the island as they will. There were attempts at creating a parliament in the 1970s, but these didn't last very long. And in fact, we see even throughout Bahrain's history, from the 1950s, the 1970s, again in the 1990s, repeated kind of popular revolts and popular protests, many of them cross-sectarian, including both Sunni and Shia, who were trying to change the political situation and to enforce more accountability and greater democracy on the ruling family. However, none of these ultimately were successful. And so I think this context is really important in understanding the current political system, and also understanding a lot of the divisions that we see. And I think when we come to discuss trying to think of political solutions and where you can find political pressure in certain areas on the island, we need to keep in mind a lot of these divisions that still exist and persist on the island. One last division that I just want to mention is also within the ruling family itself. In seeking to sort of deal with these constant problems and dissatisfaction that was coming from the Bahraini population, in the early 2000s, then there was two different sort of approaches that came to dealing with these crises. One came from the king himself, which was the National Action Charter, which was an attempt to sort of reinstate the parliament and to create a little bit more political reform on the island and create political space for people to participate. However, at the same time, this kind of the democratic impulse of these reforms, which were widely received and widely appreciated on the island, were blunted by the fact that the lower elected parliament was given sort of a minor position to the upper parliament, which was appointed, and as well a lot of gerrymandering that didn't allow for a full kind of blooming of more of a parliamentary monarchy on the island. At the same time, though, while these reforms took place and did allow for some integration, to allow some of the Shia opposition who had been in exile to come back into the island, to participate a bit more in the economy, an element that was led by the Crown Prince himself, there were some within the ruling family that thought that this greater participation was actually a threat to the ruling family. And so you have another faction within the ruling family which has a much more security-minded view of Bahrain, and particularly since the US intervention in Iraq, where you had a Shia kind of government come to power democratically, there was then an attempt to keep the Shia out of any areas of influence. And I think the back and forth between these two elements of the ruling family, one that was willing at least to allow for some political reform, allowing for some cooptation or integration of people on the island, and another element of the ruling family which was very frightened of any sort of integration, that very much did not want to allow that to happen, and was very willing to use a very strong security approach to prevent that from happening, is also a dynamic that we need to keep in mind in our discussion.
How about Matar?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to participate here today. First, let me talk about the recent deterioration in the situation in Bahrain and where things are going under those indicators for the deterioration. Even during the harsh crackdown against the protesters, there was no kind of a policy to revoke citizenship from the Bahrainis and from the activists. Recently, it is about 3 months ago, about 31 Bahraini, the ruling family and the regime in Bahrain revoked their citizenship. And the way that they were revoking their citizenship, they even did not go through the procedural step where under the law in Bahrain there should be a decree from the king to revoke any citizenship. All the decision came just from the interior minister, and without certain cases in the trials, they are saying that they are traitors and so on, but there are no cases on the trials about them. One of them, he was my friend in prison. His name is Ebrahim Karimi. Ebrahim Karimi, his lawyer went and asked for the document that show the decision for revoking his citizenship. So the public prosecutor passed it to the judge, and the lawyer asked to see it. The judge refused to give him this document. So the basic procedural steps are not anymore taking place in our judiciary system. And I consider what's going on in our judiciary system as the most punishment tool against the Bahrainis. The torture is a punishment tool in Bahrain. But if I compare it with the trials and what's going on in our judicial system, it's really bringing also another kind of a major threats to Bahrainis, whoever will speak out. And a lot of workers and a lot of organizations, a lot of advocacy about the human rights violation, and I think there should be also another work to address all the violation in our judiciary system. Another major indicators for the deterioration in Bahrain is the mass arrest. In one day in Bahrain, there were 95 detainees were convicted. The total number of years that they were sentenced to was about 800 years for those 95 prisoners. This was just in one day. Very harsh statements are going on. Those detainees were facing ill treatment, they were facing torture, and a lot of organizations report those cases. For example, one of them was Naji Fatil. He is a human rights activist, and he is charged to be affiliated with terrorist group 14 February coalitions. And the signs of torture appeared to the media and spread it everywhere, and there were no serious kind of accountability and investigation in all these practices, which give an idea that it is going in a systematic way. The excessive force, I'm talking about just the last 2 days, there are 2 serious injuries among the protesters in Bahrain. 2 of them were direct shot in the head for 2 protesters. They are in a critical situation in the hospital. And this is also, from long time, we did not get such kind of a serious injuries in Bahrain, which gave you an idea about a new trend that is going on in Bahrain. So what I want to say simply is that things are deteriorating in Bahrain, and the arrest for Khalil al-Marzouk, who is considered to be a moderate and always advocating for peaceful manner. All these are indicators about a major deterioration situation in Bahrain. And the risk there is that nobody knows where things are going in the region. When we see the relation, for example, between the Iranians and United States, when we see the relation between Iranians and Saudis, all the changes and these relations are, nobody knows what will lead to in the near future. what if the Saudis get frustrated, for example, between the relation between Iran and the United States? How will be their policy toward Bahrain? What will be the space for the Bahraini regime at that moment? All these things are evolving and put a major risk for another major deterioration and atrocities to happen in Bahrain again. So under this shaky situation, there should be a very kind of a policy, clear policy to prevent such kind of deterioration. Let me just finalize to talk about our vision. How do we look to the solution in Bahrain, and where can we reach kind of a deal to resolve this conflict? The majority of Bahrainis would like to have kind of peaceful approach to deal with the struggle. They want to fix things instead of destroying all the country and building it again from scratch. There is a strong relation between the regime of Bahrain with Saudis and with the United States. Our approach is just to build on this relation instead of thinking of destroying this relation. Our approach is to have a good relation with the United States, good relation with Saudis, and based on this relation, we have kind of a process in Bahrain. Those regional power and international power, they need to sponsor a process in Bahrain to move forward from this struggle. We are open to deal with all our sides, and we are waiting to see a partner. So I would like just to close by this statement, and I may elaborate more later.
Okay, thank you very much. So our two human rights voices here, hello, Sarah.
Hi, I guess what I'll comment on are two aspects of the popular conversation now about Bahrain, which is, you know, the picture that the Bahraini government has tried to offer to the international community via its advertising and communication agents, which is that there is reform in Bahrain. And two is the shrinking picture of the reality right now in Bahrain, which despite, you know, the image of reform that's being promoted by the government, in fact, it's getting darker and darker and harder to see inside the country, both because the government is not allowing people like Mr. Mendez in, and because it's punishing Bahrainis who speak to people in the outside world, and in fact has put in decrees and laws in place saying we will punish you, Bahraini citizens, if you dare to talk to people from, or government representatives from another country and so forth. Human Rights Watch's overall assessment of the situation in Bahrain is that there is no real reform on any of the most important issues on which even the king agreed there needed to be reform. That's not to say that there aren't measures that look like reform on the margins, and sadly I think are primarily cosmetic. Yes, the steps are being taken and people have jobs to implement reform. I'm sure there are hundreds of people who are employed in a reform office to carry out reforms, but these reforms are not meaningful. And they're not meaningful because they fail to address the two most important elements of what real reform would look like in Bahrain, which the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry said would be the most important elements. And they are, number one, accountability. And that means accountability for the deaths, torture, mass arrests, injuries that Bahraini citizens experience at the hands of their government in an attack on overwhelmingly peaceful demonstrators that the government itself recognizes and has admitted was mishandled. So in terms of security sector reform, in terms of reforming the abuses of the police and the security forces that rain down so brutally on their own citizens, there has been no real accountability. And by that I mean there has been no real accountability in the chain of command. So while there has been a veneer of a reform process of investigations and people filing torture complaints, I believe they say that there's over 140 torture investigations that are being conducted, and even, you know, a handful, a dozen police officers, I think a couple even Bahraini security officers who have been prosecuted and even jailed. Number one, none of that prosecution, none of that accountability, forget about jail time, just a suspension or a demotion or a removal from a position has come to the actual decision makers in the Bahraini security services who directed their hired quasi-mercenary security forces, police forces, the vast majority of whom are not Bahraini nationals, but are in fact hired from Sunni majority countries to come and act as police over the Shia minority population. Those decision makers, starting with the Interior Minister, going to the Attorney General, going to the prosecutor, going to the head of the police, going to the head of the security services, none of those people has faced any accountability or has even been ascribed any blame for everything that happened under their command and their watch. And so it's kind of a difficult fishbone to swallow, to have the people who are responsible for these massive attacks against their citizens sit across the table and assure us that there has been accountability and there's real reform in the security services. If there's going to be some real reform, the minimum that would happen is that these people who were in charge during these horrible abuses that, again, the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry offered up and the government accepted, would at minimum leave their jobs and, I don't know, take up accounting or something else, just go to a different profession, leave security, obviously not working out for you. That has not happened. The second thing that hasn't happened, and it would be a key element of giving the majority of the population in Bahrain some faith that they can turn a page and reach the kind of diplomatic negotiated solution that I think everyone recognizes must happen, is for those who continue to be jailed in Bahrain, who are enduring life sentences for their political views, who represent a vast, diverse political opposition in the country, from very religious, conservative political leaders to communist, leftist political leaders who are still sitting in jail. The Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry identified these 13 political leaders who were jailed for their political opinions, and as President Obama has said, it's very hard to negotiate with the opposition when the opposition is in jail. I want to remind the Bahraini government that you can't dialogue with yourself, because I'm sure you agree with everything you say, but the problem is that doesn't bring peace to the country, that doesn't restore the faith of your subjects, because sadly the people in Bahrain remain subjects, that there is going to be a new page, that there is a new page in the country. On the third point that I would make overall is that, you know, again, reform talk is nice and reform talk is polished, and I have to give credit to the Bahraini government for at least having the awareness of knowing that they need to present, maybe they don't really feel that today as much as they did last year, an image of reform, hiring security advisors from the US and the UK to, you know, show their commitment to reform, and PowerPoint presentations and media campaigns and, you know, outreach tours throughout Western nations about the reform. They know they need to talk reform, but why are they making it so hard to actually monitor what's going on in the country? Bahrain used to be an open country for Human Rights Watch, for organizations like Human Rights Watch. We actually had a fairly good working relationship with the government of Bahrain on some issues where we did believe there was a real commitment to change, such as on issues of migrant workers and labor reform. Bahrain's government was among the leaders in the GCC on those issues. That has really changed, and they have decided to shut the door in the face not only of independent human rights organizations, but UN officials, parliamentarians visiting, and so forth. And they have made it increasingly difficult for Bahrainis to speak to the outside world, as I mentioned. And this is not an accident. This is because the government has now not allowed and refusing to allow Bahrainis to exercise the basic right of protest. Emergency decrees have been passed that make it illegal for Bahrainis to assemble and to protest. and Bahrainis who defy those orders and continue to try to assemble in their villages are met with severe collective punishment. And what we're seeing, and what we've seen for the past 2 years now, is the use of tear gas, not as a weapon of crowd control, but as a weapon of collective punishment in neighborhoods and villages where protests or assemblies do take place. A way to disperse a demonstration, maybe with tear gas in that area, a way to disperse a demonstration is not by firing hundreds and hundreds of canisters across a wide area of an entire neighborhood or village to make sure that everyone in that village regrets anyone who might have organized or assembled. We continue to document cases of torture, allegations of torture. We continue to document juvenile detentions. And of course, we continue to document the unlawful arrests of political leaders like the deputy head of Al-Wifaq, who was detained last month for somehow inciting violence, even though in the speech he gave, he reiterated the fact that he opposes violent means for pursuing this. So sadly, I don't have a good story to tell right now for Bahrain, and I find myself deeply skeptical about any real commitment to reform. I think that whatever the divisions in the Bahraini government, the hardliners have won out. But I think in whatever discussion we have, I'd hope that we really consider and remember that the first priority and the first perspective we have to keep in mind is whether justice is being served. Is whether the solution that the Bahraini government is choosing is one that's fair and just. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak here. I already profusely apologize to them and to my fellow panelists for the confusion about the timing, but I also want to apologize to you, the audience, for keeping you waiting. I'm the special rapporteur on torture, and so what I'm going to say about Bahrain is somewhat limited to that narrow mandate. As you know, there are other special rapporteurs on freedom of expression and freedom of association that will probably have something more to say. But I have to say that I've been the special rapporteur now for 3 years, and almost from the outset, I've been receiving information about cases of torture and ill treatment in Bahrain, and I've had the pleasure of meeting with survivors, with former prisoners, with their families, with relatives of people who are still in prison, and their stories are really harrowing, and I am committed to trying to help them ease the pain. And it's in that situation that I asked for an invitation from the government of Bahrain. I am concerned about the deteriorating situation. I know that it goes up and down like in any other country, but we keep tabs on what's going on as much as we can, and it seems to me like the trend continues to be towards deterioration, as my predecessors in the panel have explained to you. I'm concerned about very serious cases of torture that have happened, and also the use of torture-related evidence in prosecutions against some political opponents, including doctors, for the only crime, if it can be called a crime, of fulfilling their Hippocratic duty and treating people who have been injured in demonstrations. I have tried to insist on the affirmative obligation that it's an absolute obligation of every state to investigate, prosecute, and punish every case of torture. We're also concerned about cases of excessive use of force, because my mandate is about torture, but also about cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And by definition, when the excessive use of force is so severe that it ends sending people to the hospital with serious injury, that falls within my mandate. That is part of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, even if the person is not apprehended, interrogated, or sentenced. I'm particularly concerned. I read the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry report, and it's a very powerful document. It was done in very good faith by very prominent jurists who actually visited and investigated in Bahrain, and it's very disappointing that almost 3 years later, the recommendations made by Sharif Bassiouni and his colleagues have not been implemented. As far as I can see, at least, they have not been implemented. I'm also concerned that recently the National Assembly has recommended adoption of reforms to the anti-terrorism law that in this context would give even more powers to the police and law enforcement bodies in a context in which it's very easy to call everything terrorism, and that would justify wholesale and widespread violations of human rights of every sort, but including those under my mandate, violations of the right to physical integrity. So it is against that backdrop, and besides, I continue to send communications to the government of Bahrain on those cases and on new cases that come to my attention. I have to say that the government does respond in some cases. The responses are constructive in the sense that at least they address the problems, but I have to say that at least so far, none of the responses that I've gotten have allowed me to believe that the information that I put before the government was in any way dispelled. The concerns about torture and ill-treatment were in any way dispelled, in substance at least, by the responses that I got. I also want to acknowledge that at least we know of one case in which 2 policemen have been convicted and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment for cases of torture. That is certainly a welcome development. I think if you compare it to the landscape of 3 years of very serious torture and cruelly inhuman and degrading treatment, it's a drop in the bucket. I hope it's a step in the right direction and not just a token gesture. But I think it's up to all of us to insist that more of that has to happen. It's against that backdrop that I was invited to visit Bahrain. And I have to say, there are countries that invite me and disinvite me. And in the case of my predecessors, this is not the first time that we're disinvited at the last minute. But I don't think we've ever had the case in which the same government invites me in the scope of about 1 year, and twice invites me and disinvites me also at the last minute. And I don't have to stress to you that it's a little rude, and that you can't come when you've made all the preparations. But worse than that, it means that there's some reason why your presence is not wanted. And you don't have to be overly suspicious to say, well, there's got to be some crackdown or some things that they don't want me to see. Otherwise, why invite me in the first place? So I would like to say also that the reasons given for my disinvitation, especially the second time around, left me wondering, quite frankly, because explicitly they said that it was because my presence would be an obstacle to the ongoing dialogue with the opposition. And I actually said, but being present, the special rapporteur on torture, being present at a moment in which a dialogue is going on is the best moment to have an outside presence of that sort, because I can talk to everybody, I can hear everybody, it's the best moment to have a clear picture of what's going on. And because we, all of us, approach our mandates with a constructive view, perhaps we can even bring people more together. So that doesn't seem to be a reason. And then I learned, of course, that the dialogue had been supposedly open for years, and there wasn't any particular moment that was happening right before my arrival in Manama that would make the dialogue go forward or backwards in any particular sense. And what's even worse is that then I also heard that the government, talking to other interlocutors, not to me, have said things like, well, we were afraid that Mr. Mendez would want to look backwards and not forward, meaning that I would insist on accountability for the torture that had already happened, and mind you, it didn't happen 30 or 40 years ago. It had happened in the last 2 or 3 years, and instead they wanted me to look at the reform, as Sarha just mentioned, the so-called mechanism that supposedly are being put in place to prevent torture in the future. Of course, I'm interested in those, and I would spend a lot of time learning about them. But I can't, even if it were my will, I can't come to a country on a visit and say, I won't look at the torture that has already happened, I will only look forward. If that's what they have in mind, it seems to me like I won't be invited. Maybe that's good because I won't be disinvited again, but seriously, it's a serious problem because countries will always say that they're only postponing a visit. But if in fact it is a cancellation, as I think in this case, unfortunately, I have to conclude it is, then that bodes not very well for the future of human rights and even the present of human rights in Bahrain. And finally, I want to say that the government seems to be trying to counter its image problems by inviting other international human rights leaders instead of me. For example, they invited the Commissioner for Human Rights of the European Union and the President of the Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture of the United Nations. And of course, in both cases, I think they were right in accepting the invitation under their own mandate. But it seems to me that even though in both cases they told the government that they should invite me again, it seems to me like the government is playing a game. They're inviting people to be able to say, well, we are interested in being seen from the outside, but as long as the mandate is something that they can, the terms of reference of the visit is something that they can put some controls on. Unfortunately, they can't do that with my mandate. Unfortunately for them, of course. I have to insist on the same terms of reference that I use for every state that invites me. And I can't accept conditions that violate that mandate. It's the same reason why I have not been able to accept an invitation to visit Guantanamo, because the conditions that the Pentagon wanted to give me were unacceptable under my mandate. So if Bahrain is kind of angling to invite me under terms that they consider more manageable, this visit is not going to happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those very insightful comments. So as I mentioned, if I can just pose a few questions to the panel, and if you'd like to weigh in, please do. If not, that's fine. I guess what I wanted to start with, again, on this theme of what has worked, what hasn't. If you could comment on circumstances or particular points in which the Bahraini government has responded to either domestic activism and pressure or international pressure. What have those instances been and looked like, and can they be replicated in some form or another?
Well, as I said, I do get responses from communications. Of course, I get responses from many countries, but that doesn't mean that the case itself is resolved. Hopefully, my communication and the response of the government serves to help resolve the case. But so far, I wish I could say we got this result, we obtained this release of a prisoner, we obtained this investigation of a case of torture. Unfortunately, I hope my fellow panelists have some more positive responses, but I'm going to continue trying, of course. I'm not going to give up on the cases that are brought to my attention, but I have very little to show for it. So
yeah, nothing positive from my side. Yeah, listen, for my case, let me talk about my case, for example. There was a communication from the International Parliamentarian Union about my case, my detention and ill treatment. So I raised a complaint about the ill treatment, and I was interrogated with the public prosecutor about in details in 23 hours about all what I faced in the prison. So they respond to the Parliamentarian Union by saying that the complaint of Matar had been rejected because there were not enough evidence to say that he was tortured and ill-treated. So yes, they are responding, but they are not facing the reality and dealing seriously, and they feel that they have the space to do so. And in fact, yes, they have the space to do so, and this is a major problem. If the international community, specifically if U.S. government here, will not have a clear statement and a clear assessment about what the government is doing, this is kind of a green light for the Bahraini regime just to continue. The U.S. government have a huge gap between their assessment and the assessment that are coming from Human Rights Watch, from Human Rights Affairs, from Amnesty International, all the observers, the media. Huge gap between this analysis and this findings and the findings that are coming in the, for example, the country report, the Human Rights Report for State Department. They need to bridge this gap. If they don't want to hear from us as an opposition, they should hear from the civil society here. If they consider Russia a country with non-functioning civil society, so if the civil society does work here in the United States, it should work on Bahrain also. They should bridge this gap to fix the damage that happened to the credibility of this government when they handle issues on human rights.
I'll just make one comment relative to the U.S. government. I think part of the problem is that there's been, from the very beginning, a very different perspective within different elements of the U.S. government on how to approach Bahrain. Bahrain has obviously been really important, and the U.S. government has had a very close working relationship with the government of Bahrain on security issues in the Gulf, and as the U.S. has been very concerned about Iran, in particular across the Gulf, and in trying to pressure Iran on their nuclear program and to contain Iran within the region, Bahrain has been very important, and the workings with the military and the Defense Department and Bahrain has been extraordinarily close. And I think because of that, and because of just their interests, what they're focused on, the military and all of the kind of organizations that are linked to the military have been much more sort of sympathetic to listening to the government view, and also more worried about any kind of sacrifice that will weaken their position in this broader security position. I think if you look at the State Department, though, and particularly some of the human rights bodies linked to the State Department, they've been a bit more sensitive to the domestic politics that are going on in Bahrain and willing to try to push for at least much more dialogue, much more political engagement within Bahrain. I can't say they've been incredibly effective on that, but the perspective at least has been different. And we have had some civil society organizations that have been able to use the linkages that were established, especially in Bahrain's outreach in the last 10 years, to try to hold Bahrain accountable on certain issues. One group that I'm very aware of was through the, I believe it was International Labor Organization and also AFL-CIO here in the United States, who was able to use the fact that Bahrain had signed a free trade agreement to actually try to hold Bahrain to some of the requirements within that agreement, and to look at some of these issues that I believe Matar Sarha spoke about during the initial uprising. You had a lot of people fired from their jobs, government jobs in Bahrain, and to force sort of an investigation of that and to be able to use that then as leverage in talking points with the Bahraini government. So there have been some abilities to sort of on the margins change things.
Okay, so I will actually try to ask maybe the same question a little bit differently. Can we think about the activism and the protest side of it, and also the subsequent activism? What gains have emerged from this political contention of the last 2.5 to 3 years? What strategies have worked, and have there been certain missteps or mistakes that come to mind?
Yes, I think there are many kind of activities that didn't work in Bahrain. Maybe Bahrainis were replicating the kind of activities in Egypt and around the world. And the situation is much more tough in Bahrain. For example, if our protesters will stand in front of riot police in France, they will not shoot him in his head, but they will shoot him in his head in Bahrain. So we shouldn't just replicate what demonstrators are doing in France or in Europe or in the United States or anywhere. We should invent what will work for us. For me, I'll talk specifically about myself. I always encourage the protester to take care about their safety. So if the government doesn't take care about their safety and they don't care what will happen to the protesters, they should have more, they should do, and they should take care more about their safety. Such kind of advices will not work because the frustration among the protesters is very high. And this makes a real problem for us in Bahrain, where whenever we are trying to convince the protester to seek new ways for activism, new ways for dealing with this conflict, it is kind of, we are blaming them, and as the problem is from their side, while they are killed and they are tortured and they are receiving the excessive force. So it is really very tough time to kind of revise the policies and advocate for renew. It is really a job that needs a lot of creativity and braveness.
I just want to pick up on Matar's comments, because I think the context of that question is more important than anything else, and I think it's a kind of odd perspective if you think about any struggle for democracy and rights and freedom. And in some cases, those struggles are armed. They're armed revolutions. The American Revolution was an armed revolution. The French Revolution was an armed revolution. We can go around the world and think about those. And a very, very, very small minority of uprisings, uprisings for rights and freedom, uprisings that sometimes start as reform movements, other times demand a change in government, that are peaceful. And if we look at Bahrain in the context of a history of uprisings, a history of human instinct for rights and freedom, in a moment in the region where there were mass uprisings, some armed, like the one in Libya, which the United States government supported, like the one in Syria, which the US government kind of supports. And in that context, again, we see Bahrain's uprising as an overwhelmingly peaceful demand, almost polite demand for rights and reform that in some cases had some people saying, we want the king to leave, we actually don't want an autocratic monarchy anymore, it's kind of out of date now. And then sort of judge, well, did the protesters go too far? Did they misjudge it? And I think, my answer to that is definitely not, because probably any individual who sits back and thinks, should I join a protest movement? Should I go out in the streets in the face of guns and live ammunition, where there's a good chance that some riot police from Iraq or Pakistan will shoot me in the head? Or should I stay home? Well, certainly the rational choice may be stay home. But in that moment, and this is why I made that comment about justice, in that moment of thinking you're sticking your neck out for justice, you're sticking your neck out for principles and values that I think most of us share, then the answer is, well, of course they did the right thing.
Me too.
think that despite all these frustrating outcomes, the situation in Bahrain does allow for some work in support of the democracy movement, and for whatever reason the government of Bahrain is self-conscious about its image. And that, in my experience, mostly from Latin America, but also in other countries, is a handle. It is an angle that we can use. I think not only the report, but the actual work going into the Bahrain International Commission of Inquiry is an example of that. I mean, it's a very credible report. It has very strong recommendations. It has, and we can put pressure on the government of Bahrain to implement them and to show that they're implementing them, and to let everybody else judge objectively whether they're implementing them or not. Is it going to happen again? I mean, obviously we don't need another high-level visit or a commission of inquiry, but we need to know what's going on with the recommendations made by the DICI. And I think the fact that the government invites, people to talk about torture. For example, they're not going to sign and ratify the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. They've announced that they won't, and yet they invite the president of the subcommittee to discuss something like a national preventive mechanism. Well, I think we should insist that they actually sign and ratify the protocol, and if they want to have a serious national preventive mechanism, they should do it under the protocol and not, something hybrid or something that they concoct out of what would otherwise be something like a national preventive mechanism. The same with the police ombudsman. It's important that they create it, but it's more important to see how it operates in practice. And I don't doubt that there are some people of goodwill, even within the government of Bahrain, that want to use these institutions in the right way. But I think more important for the rest of us, it gives us a chance to call on the government of Bahrain to let us look into it in a serious and unobstructed way, and report on it as objectively as we can.
Did you want to mention the Shamarad movement, maybe?
Sure. I guess I'm going to take a step a bit different, maybe because I view things from a political angle, not the human rights angle. I want to say first that I've been incredibly inspired watching the protesters in Bahrain. We are almost 3 years now, carrying on from the initial protests, and I do have to say I follow Bahrain very closely, and I continue to see protests, almost weekly in that country. And given the level of suppression that has happened against these people, I find it just incredible that people are still willing to go out to the streets and face this, and just the persistence and the real willingness to demand their rights has been inspiring just for me to watch. On the other hand, I do think that we're at a situation where perhaps some of these protests are reaching diminishing returns in Bahrain. We have to kind of acknowledge that the government has been successful in pushing the protests into Shia villages so that they can't get the big, it's much harder to get the broad-based protests that were happening once in Manama. And out of frustration that the protests aren't actually achieving that much, we have seen some escalation in violence in these villages by the protesters using Molotov cocktails, and more recently we have seen some kind of crude bombs being used in Bahrain. And I think this is really the perhaps sort of understandable in the context of what's going on, extraordinarily problematic for the cause of democracy and for pressing for reform in Bahrain, exactly because of the sort of divisions that I spoke of earlier. There's a lot of sort of distrust amongst some in the Bahraini population and civilization and citizens, and when they see things coming just consistently out of these villages, which unfortunately are sort of Shia, it reinforces this kind of view of sort of a Shia uprising, and takes away from the broader project, which I think really, and I'm convinced really is a project to achieve more both accountability and greater political participation within Bahrain. So I think as difficult as it is, there needs to be continued sort of approach of trying to reach out to others within Bahrain. We definitely do see a lot of people, apart from the main opposition movement, the Shia Islamist movement, that are interested in seeing these changes, but it's going to be more difficult to build those coalitions that are really going to be needed to achieve change in Bahrain if things are escalating to a greater degree of violence.
Great. So, as my final question, I'll table the rest of my questions after this for the audience. There's been a lot invested by both political and human rights activists, Bahraini political and human rights activists, in forging international alliances, and particularly, working within UN systems, different UN mechanisms. I was very interested to see the Bahraini presence at the Universal Periodic Review, the Human Rights Council, and even Al-Wafaq as a political party sent a delegation. And of course, there's been quite a bit of effort to lobby and to have discussions and influence here in the United States, in Washington. So I'm wondering, how can we gauge this as a strategy of the international emphasis by activists? Is there too much? Is there too little? Is it working? Anything that you want to say, and I know we've touched upon it a bit, but what have been the gains of all of these international efforts?
I believe that the scale of atrocities will be much wider without this effort and this kind of activism. In Bahrain, there is a debate, and even here, is the Crown Prince reformist or not? For me, I don't know, but I'm sure about one thing, that he does care about his image. So, because he does care about his images, this is an entrance for us just to focus and to bring the focus on those violations and to encourage the international community, the European countries, US government, UN bodies, just to speak out, because it does work. Maybe it didn't solve our problem, and we are going to continue to communicate with the international community. It is just one dimension. I think that whatever effort is done on it, we can't say that we did perfectly. We need always to do more on this dimension.
All right. So how about we just open it up for questions here? Let's see. Maybe we can take. Okay. So a hand up right here.
Thank you for a very informative discussion about Bahrain and the laws. I was wondering, there would be a sharpened tension between Shiites and Sunnis within Bahrain, given the government's approach to the protests. What can be or what is being done in civil society efforts to create dialogue and to foster collaboration between Sunnis and Shiites in Bahrain?
You want to take a whole repeat question?
Yeah, let's take two or three questions. How about Barbara? Go ahead. Did you have a question?
Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. My name is Barbara Lean and I teach nonviolence here. What are the prospects of massive nonviolent resistance within Bahrain, such as the stay-at-home movement? Street protests are not working. It's putting people in greater jeopardy. I thought I had read last summer that there was a stay-at-home movement where people were refusing to work. The bankers wouldn't bank, the trains wouldn't run, the teachers wouldn't teach. And actually, I want to challenge the good woman from Human Rights First that far greater numbers of revolutions have been nonviolent in the history of the world, but we're never taught that in our textbooks. So what are the prospects for massive nonviolent resistance within Bahrain, number one? Number two, I'd like to turn the lens on ourselves and say that we have tremendous leverage here. Maybe tremendous is a little bit overblown. But we have some influence because the Khalifi family are alumni here and help fund this building. So what pressure can we put as faculty and students on the ruling family to relinquish their power? And number three, what would be the next generation of leaders to take the reins when the ruling family has to step down? Because it's coming, it's inevitable. So would there be a new generation of leaders like yourself, who's so courageous, Matar? Thank you for your courage. Prepared to step up to the plate so that we're ready in ways that we weren't in the other nonviolent revolutions recently in the Middle East. So I want to talk about where can we put pressure to bear. I want to recruit all these good people to join the struggle, and I want to hear what is the health of nonviolent resistance within the society, if that's even a possibility. Thank you all for your excellent remarks. They were brilliant, and thank you for your stick-to-itiveness on this issue.
Maybe one last question? Yes.
He has a speech disability.
Here. Me, what's that?
This is Winston. He has aphasia, so he has a speech disability.
Because of his extensive business dealings there, Winston was a personal friend of the royal family in Bahrain. In 2008, he lent a large sum of money to a member of the royal family in connection with establishing an auto dealership. Although the loan was supposed to be paid off by the end of 2009, the borrower failed to do so. Winston traveled to meet with the borrower in Bahrain in 2011 to discuss the situation. The meeting didn't go well. The borrower denied responsibility for paying the loan, and Winston was upset by his attitude. Winston reached down under the table, pulled off his shoe and threw it at the borrower. Pandemonium broke loose and Winston was angrily escorted out of the house and almost jailed. After all, it is a crime in Bahrain to insult a member of the royal family. He was detained for a short while and then released and left the country a few weeks later when he returned to his home in rural Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C. Winston was still upset by his treatment in Bahrain. He was determined to do something about it. Winston heard about an upcoming protest at the White House and decided to participate. Although Winston supported the objectives of the protest, his primary purpose was to express his anger at the president for his support of the Bahraini government. Since his return, Winston had learned more about the political situation in Bahrain and the terrible repression of the Shiite majority by the Sunni minority. Ahmed al-Khalifa shoot that hit a Muslim Sunni royal family. I threw my shoe at Ahmed al-Khalifa. It was a chaos after that. The family was mad. They jumped at me and tried to have me arrested and put me in jail. However, not only was Ahmed not mad, he stayed calm and started to have a nice conversation with me.
Okay. Unbelievable, because military, you know? Military, it's like unbelievable.
Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to actually give the panel a chance to respond. There's a few questions here.
Sure. I think when we look at the question that you asked about coalitions, trying to build coalitions within Bahrain, I mean, I think if we look from the beginning of the protest, I mean, there were really a lot of active work to do that. And if you look at the initial movement that started the protests, it contained both Sunni and Shia. if you look at the parties that later joined the protest, it contained both leftist parties that contained Sunni and Shia, as well as the mainstream Islamist Shia, al-Wifaq. And so I think definitely that is there on the ground. I think, like I said, that a lot of the tactics that have been used in the course of the protests, though, by the government itself, in a broader context, and I think this was another question you had thought about as well, Shadi, of the region, has been very detrimental to that. I mean, where we've seen a lot of rising sectarian tension in the way that the conflict in Syria is now being played, and the way that Saudi Arabia is trying to counter the rise of Iran. And so that this sort of sectarian message makes it much more difficult to build those coalitions. But I think if you look over the last decade, even within a Shia Islamist party like al-Wifaq, definitely the message has consistently been that they're working with the government, that they're working with other parties, that they're pushing for something that's for the benefit of all Bahrainis, and trying to sort of ease some fears that other Bahrainis have. I think probably even more work needs to be done on that, although we have to acknowledge that's being done in a very difficult regional context.
I'll just add about I'll just add about the sectarianism. From my point of view, is that sectarianism is something superficial, and it is a symptom for different major problem. Our major problem in Bahrain is about kleptocracy. We have a regime which would like to control all the assets and all the resources of the country through a fake institution called government. So the government is just a tool to control these assets. And all the human rights violations, from my point of view, and all the sectarianism is just a symptom for this problem. What I mean that if the government can steal all the assets without a human rights violation, without sectarianism, they will do it.
Exactly.
But they are doing it just to reach their specific goal. If I look to the situation in Egypt, this makes my theory much more credible. Because in Egypt, you will see families which have Islamist, from Muslim Brotherhood, Salafist, liberal, leftist, nationalist, all they are living in one house. If you see the atrocities that happen after the coup, you'll get surprised. How can the Egyptian go in a deep crackdown like this, and they are not divided based on sect? In Bahrain, with all what happened, if I compare it with Egypt, thanks God that we are in Bahrain with this sectarianism that we are facing. I'm not saying that our life is perfect. No, we have a major problem with sectarianism in our region. But I believe that all effort for addressing the sectarianism at this time will not reach a conclusion, because the cause of sectarianism is the kleptocracy. Without handling this major issue, we will not move forward. And once we have a kind of a resolution, a solution for this regime, then the supply for the hatred language will be shut down immediately. Of course, the escalation of all the long-term time of these problems will have an impact. And it will need time to recover from all the sectarianism. But my deep belief is that the problem is somewhere else, and rarely you see kind of that much analysis, and there is not that much work to address this problem, the kleptocracy. And the focus maybe sometime will be just about the violation and the sectarianism, which are just, from my point of view, just as symptoms.
perspective of my mandate, it really, I look at the ethnic or religious composition of the society and of the human rights violations mostly as background, because as you can imagine, torture is torture. It doesn't really matter who is the victim, with one exception, however. If the evidence shows that the torture is inflicted in any form of discriminatory purpose, and particularly if it is inflicted with racial or religious discrimination in mind, then of course that's an aggravated form of torture. And of course we reflected, if we find it in the evidence. It's a little difficult when you're working on a case-by-case basis to do it that way. And that's why country visits are important, because you can concentrate during a visit and look at the overall picture, to look at many cases at the same time and try to discern whether there's a discriminatory intent or not. If you only get to see some cases that are brought to your attention via email, it's very difficult to make a judgment of that sort. Similarly, the question of whether the strife is peaceful or violent is also outside my mandate, because even in situations that are much more violent, where the rebellion is much more violent than I've ever heard of it being in Bahrain, we have a mandate to work on it, because the prohibition on torture and on cruel and inhuman and degrading treatment is absolute. And absolute means that there's no situation that allows a government to consider it a state of exception. So no matter how violent the situation is, there are still prohibitions that we have to uphold. And again, it's not for me to say whether there's opportunities for non-violent or whether the demonstrators are, have a purpose of overthrowing the government by violent means. Obviously, governments have a right and even a duty, I would say, to defend themselves from some violent activity. What they cannot do is, cross over the threshold and apply torture or a variety of other techniques of human rights violations and justify them in terms of the violent nature of the threat that they face.
Right, can we get another set of questions?
So I just want to add one to the mix, and then I'm going to turn it over here. But go back to what you guys were saying about, or some of the panelists talked about, the image consciousness. I just wanted to see if anyone comment on the role U.S. PR firms play in presenting Bahrain a certain way for public consumption.
Thank you very much for this excellent panel. I have a bit of a broader question, and it's, what's the way forward? And I'm becoming quite pessimistic about, what the prospects are in the coming years and possibly decades. And I'm wondering if any of you can strike a more positive note, and maybe this is also addressed to Matar. I mean, WIFAQ is the kind of main group that tries to work within the system and seek some solution to the problem now. That clearly is not working, and WIFAQ itself is being targeted and leaving the dialogue. At the same time, the opposition in the streets, February 14th, are very much anti-WIFAQ, and I think most people agree that opposition that tries to work with the state is kind of being sidelined to a certain extent, or at the same time, these people, February 14th is targeted, so we don't even know what's going to emerge now out of that. If even this group then gets targeted, will we see actual violence afterwards? And so, on the other side, some Sunnis are traveling to Syria to wage jihad, and within the royal family, you certainly don't see a strengthening of the crown prince or anybody who would like to have a deal or some political reform. And also, the Americans are not doing anything. Are you prepared for? I mean, will we meet here in 10 years and have similar? Have these cups and just think about some down-line era, or do you have any vision about when anything could be
achieve. Yeah. First, let me return back to the Barbara question there. I would like to tell you, Barbara, that I feel that the majority of Bahrainis are still seeking solution through peaceful manner, and I don't feel that a small country with a small size, island like Bahrain, have the capacity to go for violence methods on long term, continuous violence to reach a kind of settlement or solutions. So our environment keeps us with one option, which is the peaceful manner, at least for this time. This is under the current conditions, and I'm happy for this because we would like to reach solution with the least cost. Returning back to your question, yes, I think the image is dark, and as I said from the beginning, that the possibilities for atrocities in Bahrain is there. The possibility for major deterioration in Bahrain is there. Later, we cannot talk about political activists. We are just talking about people who are victims and they are just under persecutions. They are not a political player, which is totally different frame. But I feel that if I compare the struggle in Bahrain with the struggle in the other countries in the region, I believe that Bahrain has the most achievable struggle to be resolved. Comparing with Syria, comparing with the problem in Egypt, comparing with Saudis, what are they going to face in the coming 5 to 10 years, they will face a major problems. If I compare Bahrain with those countries, I can say that Bahrain have the most environment for achievable solution. Bahrain as a small country, it doesn't really represent a threat if you see kind of a change. If Shia came to power, they will not represent a threat for US government or for Saudis. Saudis will not go for a huge revolution if Bahrain get improvement in terms of democracy. In fact, where there was a progress in Bahrain in 2001, when the king came with the charter and came with the constitution, there were no revolution in East province to call for the same. In fact, the impact, the risk of a major problem for stability of monarchies is not that much huge. There is a huge exaggeration about the risk of reform in Bahrain on the stability of monarchies. I believe that the risk from Egypt on the situation in Saudi Arabia is more. That's why the Saudis were they were very involved in the call because they feel the threats from Muslim Brotherhood to be in power. And there is another threat which comes from Turkey. The model in Turkey represents a threat where the Saudis can be inspired of the Turkey model, but not from a model from a Shia in Bahrain. This is not highly expected. Because of that, the deal in Bahrain is achievable, and it will retain in a positive impact on all. It is a win-win-win situation. Win for Bahrainis, win for Americans, and win for Saudis. The Saudis are getting a lot of troubles for backing hardliners in Bahrain. And the Americans, they cannot speak, and nobody can take them seriously when they talk about Syria if they are just ignoring what happened in Bahrain. So a major problem with their credibility if they are just ignoring what happened in Bahrain. This make the deal in Bahrain can happen with one loser. The loser in this deal is the hardliner of Bahrain. So because of this frame, I think the chances are there. And our work here is just to advocate for the reform, encouraging all international players just to support this idea. It is not just kind of US government kind of a moral obligation to talk about human rights in Bahrain. It is beyond moral obligations, because US government is involved in Bahrain because of having the Fifth Fleet, because of the recognition that is given to the Bahraini regime as strategic ally and close friend. Such kind of recognition is a major asset for the Bahraini regime. That's why US government is involved and need to act beyond the moral obligations.
Anyone else want to weigh in on the questions posed?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, just on the sectarian note, in any situation, I think, and I'm sure there are many of you here who are far more expert than I, where a government faces demands or issues of discrimination or injustice, inequality against either a minority population or a majority population that's distinct because of their race or their religion, ultimately it's the government's responsibility and obligation to address it. And they can choose to fan the flames of racial division, religious hatred, and so forth. Or when they're vulnerable, as the Bahraini government might feel itself as a minority religious faction ruling over a majority that does not believe that they are treated with equal rights or justice or fairness or democracy, that the government make some changes to re-win at least some faith of most people so that they can return to their normal lives. Because what's happening now in Bahrain, the situation now in Bahrain is not normal. The capital city under lockdown, roadblocks everywhere, traffic interrupted, international business having fled, many of the sort of wealthier migrant community, business community not returning. None of these things are in the interests of Bahrain, putting aside even potential tensions with the US and the EU and so forth. So even from the short-term strategic interest of the Bahraini government, they would do well to implement the recommendations for reform that the Beki Commission made. If Human Rights Watch repeating them sounds too radical, then listen to what Beki says, which is accountability. Let the population have some faith that the policemen in the streets represent them, look like them, include community policing. It's a very common concept, and I'm surprised Mr. Timoney has not advised on the benefits and advantages of community policing. An African-American neighborhood in the United States would not want to see an all-white police force, and they probably wouldn't want to see even an all-Russian white police force, just to give you a parallel. And so those kinds of changes, show the population that they have something to believe in and to invest in a government that may be of a different religious sect, but that they at least feel will have some modicum of representing their interests and their concerns.
Just
maybe the moving forward question, the tough question.
Give me the tough one. Well, I'll just make an observation. I mean, there's one problem in the political dynamics in Bahrain that make it really difficult, and I think the divisions in the ruling family are really important here. And what they mean is that there's one side, the reformers in Bahrain, they basically had a strategy within Bahrain of international engagement, international economic engagement, of bringing money into the country, really care about Bahrain's international image, all of these sorts of things. That's the reformers. The other side doesn't really care much about any of those things. They're very centered in the security apparatus in Bahrain and then also in the royal court. They're very close as well to Saudi Arabia, and they know they can always rely on Saudi Arabia if things get tough. So if the economic situation is difficult, then they can rely on Saudi Arabia to make up for that and to draw closer to Saudi Arabia, which is why a lot of people in that camp are actually supporting union with Saudi Arabia. So the challenge, I think, for people who really care about reform in Bahrain is to think about how you can frame kind of actions so that they will empower sort of one element over another. And I really do believe that these divisions are important. There are some people who don't think that those are important, but I tend to believe they are. And what that means is that if you're trying to do big boycotts and disengage from Bahrain, I'm not sure that that ultimately helps the situation in Bahrain. And I'd be interested to hear Matar's opinion on this. They need to be framed in a way that keeps that sort of communication going and that strengthens, gives strength to the elements that actually want to see reform.
Yeah, I just agree with you.
All right, are there any?
Yes, we're here. We've heard bits back and forth about the U.S. relationship to Bahrain, but nothing at all about the prospects for American citizens pressuring their own government to, like in so many other cases over the years, to pull its support. I'm not saying that's been successful, I'm saying there's been that pressure to pull its support from this regime because it's not doing us any good and not doing them any good. Why would the Fifth Fleet be based there? We're in North America, not the Middle East. It's none of our business. And were you being sarcastic when you suggested that John Timoney, that fascist pig, might actually support community policing in Bahrain? I mean, this is the jackbooted goon who organized the repression in Miami in 2003 of the FTAA. So please tell me that was sarcastic.
I can't admit to sarcasm.
Let me just have the last two questions here, and then.
Hi, I'm Salman from Bahrain. I have two questions. The first one, I think that we continue, especially observers and critics, continue to talk about Bahrain in this kind of binary narrative where it's government versus people, or king versus opposition, or majority, minority, and I think we're neglecting that it is a very vast spectrum of not only opinions, but also recommendations. And you know, if we want to preach democracy and democratic values, then we have to ensure that any way forward needs to be formed on a consensus. And I think in Tamalad, when we had August 14th, which is considered to be a failure even by the opposition, was a very clear eye-opener that there is no consensus on, even within the opposition, they are very fragmented. And this is why there is a current dialogue to actually make sure that there is no ceiling of demands, that everyone will come forward with whatever you want, whether it's an elected president, whether it's a republic, and forward, and whatever is agreed on as a consensus, that is what will be achieved. So I'm just wondering why have observers neglected the silent majority, the people in the middle, that fail to fall under a particular umbrella, and they are discarded from the popular narrative. One more thing, I'm also curious why, I mean, Kristin mentioned it briefly, but about the increasing use of violence, of guerrilla warfare. We live in a very volatile region, and when the security apparatus is quite fragile, it has opened up this kind of vacuum for extremism. And this is not a case of Bahrain, this happens in Syria, it happened in Libya. And we've had, you know, even the US administration, which, for example, supported al-Nusra Front in Syria, and then considered them a terrorist organization. And personally, I mean, I'm born and raised in Bahrain, I lived there throughout the spring, and I've been under several Molotov cocktail showers. Me, my family, I have been in roadblocks, I have been terrorized. I'm not saying that I'm not the only one, but this is a very prevalent, serious problem. And I'm wondering why this was not given enough weight in talking about Bahrain. Thanks.
So I think we will close with that question.
Is it a quick one? Just throw it out there.
Yeah, I'll throw out a really quick question. So Mark Hankin from the Solidarity Center, which is a labor rights and human rights promotion organization. So I was just intrigued by the overriding themes that come through about lack of representation. And in my case, the lack of, and this relates actually to our friend in the back's question in a way, there is a kleptocracy that's doing quite well in Bahrain. What is the current situation of common people when it comes to the economy and economics? And is it sustainable, even though the Saudis are able to give some money? Are those sorts of subsidies sustainable over a period of time? And will it draw people together who want rights and want access to protect their families and do better for their families in the country?
Thank you. How questions posed, please give your responses. And if you want to add any concluding remarks, please do so. And this time we'll start with Juan. I won't invite you to the floor and disinvite you.
Well, thank you. It's been a very interesting discussion, and I appreciate all the questions. I think I made it clear in my previous answer that all states have an obligation to protect law and order, to defend themselves from violence, etc. But it has limits, and international law is clear on that. I mean, there's no rocket science on it. There's some things you can't do, even if a state is under siege. The question is not whether the background to the struggle more or less explains or justifies anything that happened. It may, states have a right to suspend certain rights, for example, derogate during states of emergency under some conditions, obviously, and not willy-nilly. But torture is one of those non-derogable rights that cannot ever be justified under any circumstance. And the obligation to investigate, prosecute, and punish the cases of torture is also absolute. It has to happen on every single case, even if it were not a widespread and systematic pattern. If none of that is happening, then you have to conclude that perhaps there is a pattern of violations that cannot be a policy program that cannot be explained away, and especially cannot be justified because of some threat that the country is under. On the matter of the consensus, of course, we all hope and wish that there may be some consensus that would diminish the violence and eventually resolve the underlying conflict in the society. For that, all of us in the international human rights movement would be more than willing to help on that. But I have to remind everybody that the first responsibility for forming the consensus, for making the consensus happen, is in the state. It's because the state has the power of the state, and because it represents the country before the international community, and it's guaranteed some sovereign rights, therefore the state has more responsibilities than anybody else. And it's important to see, and that's why it's important to visit and to scrutinize what's going on, to see whether the state is really in good faith trying to reach a consensus, or whether it's just saying, well, there's no consensus, so we have to operate the way we're operating.
Yeah, I'd like to answer the question, your question of Mark here. When I was a member of the parliament in the Economic and Financial Committee, I was shocked by a curve given to us from the finance minister. The curve was showing a linear growth in our revenue and exponential growth in our expenditure. Most of the expenditure was going on recurrent expenditure, which goes for salaries. We are already facing a deficit in our budget, and based on, I think, about the World Bank, by 2018, Bahrain will fail to handle the debt in their budget. So it is really a major issue that threatens all Bahrainis. And new Bahrainis are getting involved much more than before. For example, under the Sunni community, there are Tajamma al-Fatih, Shabab al-Fatih. It is a new a group from the Sunni community who are talking about the kleptocracy and talking about the corruption in the state and looking forward a solution. Until now, there is no kind of a coordination between those new groups and the mainstream of the opposition. But I believe it is an issue of time. And at the end, the government, if they can have a repression policy against the majority, a huge people who are joining a protest, if another group join them, they can also use the same mechanism based on repression. So if more Sunnis join us, nothing will change in the mechanism of repression. It will go the same. That's why sponsoring a process for a solution from regional and international powers is something essential to see things moving forward.
I guess not to bore people, but I guess if you know, I having traveled to Bahrain as recently, and I hope not the last time, earlier this year, and having many conversations with many Sunnis who have had experienced a lot of fear and insecurity over the past year. If there's some sort of consolation in recognizing that some protesters, and from every bit of documentation we've seen, we think that the smallest minority, smallest percentage of protesters have used violent means, not just Molotov cocktails, but in some cases actually physically attacking security forces, government forces. I think there's even a case of a woman who was trapped in a car and removed from a car and so forth. Of course, that's the case, and that's happened. From my perspective, observing uprisings all over the entire Middle East and North Africa region, what I find remarkable is that there wasn't more violence and more rage. And I think it's a tribute to Bahraini society and the experience of the Bahraini population of dealing with each other, working with each other, having some modicum of a political process, having some experience with opposition and back and forth, that makes me more optimistic that there can and should be a solution in Bahrain that doesn't look like Syria, that doesn't look like Libya. But in fact, that is also that option. And since we don't want that to happen, we should take a good look at the national dialogue and see whether we really think it's a good and fair and honest way of having a dialogue and moving forward with a political process. When the monarchy wants to pretend that it's not really part of the dialogue, this is just something for the political parties to sort out. I mean, right then and there, we have a problem. When the majority, the vast majority of the participants in the dialogue actually are pro-government forces and parties, and when the leadership of, not the silent majority, the vocal majority of Bahrain is sitting in jail and in prison, is that really the national dialogue that's going to bring us the peacefully negotiated outcome that we know most Bahrainis, silent or vocal, in fact want? And I think the answer is no.
Just to add my own perspective on this about the divisions in Bahrain. I mean, when I look back to the early days of the Arab Spring and the uprisings that happened, I mean, I think the great promise, the early promise that was communicated in those uprisings, whether they took place in Tunisia or in Egypt or in Bahrain, was basically that of basically a citizenship protest. It was a protest with people rising up, wanting to say that they deserve respect, that they deserve a say in how their state should be governed, and that they deserve basically to have the state organized in a way that pays attention to the needs of the citizens and to treats them on an equivalent basis. I'm pretty convinced that that is as well what was going on in Bahrain as well in the early days, but I think we have to acknowledge that there's a big, a difficult environment in Bahrain to get that message across, because there is intense distrust, I think, across Bahrain and amongst Bahraini communities. And I think this comes from, as I started in the beginning of my talk, from the origins of the state, from the way that the state was come together, and the way that different communities actually haven't always been able to interact. I mean, definitely in some areas they do, but in some areas they really have intense distrust and intense misunderstanding of each other. So, and that being said, I think a genuine national dialogue where people were really reaching out to each other and trying to understand where they have come from, the sort of discriminations that they face, the kind of challenges that they face, could be really useful in people identifying what are some of the common problems that people face and some that aren't so common, and that the state has treated people in different ways. I think the problem in Bahrain right now is that the environment is such, and the state has put forth an environment where the media is really trying to, I think, drive people apart. There's a lot of misinformation in what's being put out there in Bahrain. And so in that sort of context, it's very difficult to get to that kind of common dialogue in which I think Bahrainis could really find a way forward. But I think it is something that the Bahrainis are going to have to strive for and hopefully succeed.
Thank you so much to each of our panelists who I think added tremendous insight to this discussion. I do hope we can invite you all back to another panel, but one in which the prognosis is considerably better, and we're not repeating the same conversations again in 2 years. But if the audience would join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you all again for coming today. In my earlier thanks, I did not thank the Muslim Student Association, so I also want to thank them for sponsoring and supporting the event. Thank you all for being here. If you can hold on just 1 second, Giselle is the president of Creative Peace Initiatives, and they actually do have an initiative related to this event that she would like to share.
One last thing, thank you all for this really informative discussion. If you were inspired by this discussion, as Barbara said, there is something we can do. We actually started a letter, it's a public letter to the conference, and if you haven't already, please sign up either on the ADHRB list or our list, and we can send it to you. It's an electronic petition, basically calling on the conference to take a more leadership role in these in dialogue. So, yes, thank you all for coming.